All right, so now we're going to dive into some news on quantum chips and quantum computing. So this week was a big week for news on quantum computing. IBM released some new quantum computing tech, as well as Google released Willow. And so Sundar tweeted about this, kind of breaking down some of the functionality of Willow. And, at the end of the day, I think this is a lot of like marketing and hype still because it's still such early days. Basically, Willow was able to solve a problem that would take a regular computer the same amount of time as the age of the universe, right? So that sounds really impressive, right? But and this is really impressive tech that has a lot of potential. So I worked with the quantum key network at Ericsson previously in Sweden, where they were building the first quantum key distribution network that was basically being able to send quantum photons from one endpoint to another and be able to transfer that information. And you see a lot of progress in quantum computing, a lot of hype about maybe this is going to allow AI to take off. Maybe this is going to break the internet, because everything we're doing right now is through encryption, so that all of our data isn't just broadcasted over the internet. And if quantum computers can crack that, then we have no more security, right? But then we could just encrypt things with quantum computers if it really gets to that. But anyways, if we try to dive into this and quickly summarize what happened here, on a very complex topic, I must say, so forgive me, but I'll do my best to try to give some information here that's relevant. But basically, a traditional computer operates on zeros and ones, right? And a quantum computer operates with qubits, which are able to represent a vector of zeros and ones, basically a probability distribution, which allows them to transfer a lot more data in that word, as it's called, of 64 bits than a traditional computer would be able to do. And so this is why they're able to solve much more complex problems. But really, the problem Willow solved was a problem that had quantum nature to it, right? So if you want to understand quantum mechanics, you got to go try to read about it and then maybe bang your head against it for another few weeks, and you might get somewhere, right? And there's if I try to dumb this down a little bit, basically, when you're looking at what quantum computers can solve, they're finding algorithms that are very well suited to these types of compute systems. And these compute problems are very hard for traditional computers to solve, but quantum computers are able to solve them. So you're not seeing, and also these chips are operating at like absolute zero. They're incredibly expensive. They have a high error rate. Willow made some progress on that as well. So we're still a long ways away, I would say, from quantum computers really entering the mainstream. But then again, this is an awesome area of technology, and it's cool to see Google pushing it forward, right? So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I would say on this. Emmanuel, do you have any thoughts on quantum computing, or what's your impression of this?
No, I don't have any thoughts on this at all. I've just been listening to you talk about this topic. It makes it more understandable because I remember looking into it, and yeah, I mean, I saw qubits and I was like, what is that? How does this
Yeah.
work? And what problems do quantum computers actually solve? That's something that I was always very curious about. And yeah, but you make it sound a lot better, you know.
Yeah, so I mean, they could be really useful for like being able to model like really complex physics in the real world. They could be, there's certain quantum things that happen with like light. So if you're trying to analyze how light is going to transfer through like an ice cube, quantum computers could give you a really good way of estimating the like how that light is going to disperse through that. It just gets into like really nerdy, really scientifical stuff, which is often how these these things start out, right? But then basically, if they can get this error rate lower and scale this up, that's when it gets more and more interesting. So if we start to be able to, one thing is they're only able to keep that qubit in that state for like, I should have the data in front of me, but I want to say like 20 milliseconds or even smaller. Basically, Google like 5x'd the amount of time they could keep the qubit in that state, which then allows you to have like a lower error rate and be able to observe it better. So, a lot of great progress in the space, still very early days. I think this is just one of those things that kind of blows up as well in the tech space because it's so hard to understand and it sounds so futuristic. It's kind of like we're calling LLMs artificial intelligence when they're really just like matrix multiplication on a massive network of nodes with like gradient descent for training. So we don't actually have like a cognizant intelligence behind ChatGPT or any of these. We understand so little about the brain, but it gets hyped because it has the name AI, right? So really exciting to see. I mean, I think quantum's awesome, but I think we're probably still 5-10 years away from really seeing some good applications. That's not too long though. So yeah.
I have a question about this for you. Where do you think the future will be going to when it comes to these quantum chips? Like where will we see the future of these? Like, I'm not that smart about quantum chips, but like, where do you see this? Will it be commercialized at some point, or how does this work?
Yeah, so I mean, once they're able to produce these at a point where they can really solve certain algorithms at a high clip, things like Bitcoin's encryption are something that a quantum computer would be really good at solving potentially. So that's like a huge risk to Bitcoin, right? Like if their encryption is able to be cracked by quantum computers, then you would need a quantum type of algorithm, encryption algorithm to secure the network. So I think that's probably going to be like one big shift once these get useful is it's basically a much more powerful type of computer that creates a problem solving ability we haven't seen before. And since they're able to solve lots of modern encryption, it requires that we kind of re-encrypt the internet based on this. That's one thing I see. You also could see artificial intelligence training. So we're going to talk about XAI and what's going on there. But if you're able to train a neural network on a quantum cluster and it's able to have much more parallelism, basically in a neural network that's training, every single GPU needs to know what every other GPU in the cluster is solving and what they're doing. And quantum chips can do that through quantum entanglement, which allows them to know what the other qubits are doing, right? So it has potential there to solve that. But again, I'm just a layman in this space. So these are just kind of my observations. And ultimately, I think, let's just root for the people who are building this. And then once there's some practical applications, let's get to building, right? So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, interesting.
All right, cool. So Chinese EVs. Emmanuel, maybe you could just give us an overview of this topic and what we're going to go into here.
So Chinese EVs getting cancelled, question mark. I think maybe that's a bit of a going too far a little bit, but yeah, so basically what happened is that the EU started to implement tariffs on electric vehicle imports, and I think we mentioned it before also, like when we were talking about this backstage, but like 45% increase in tariffs on electric vehicles, right? And then there was basically these Chinese electric vehicles who are now shifting. I mean, I can quote it right here. They're shifting toward plug-in hybrids as a way to sidestep the new EU tariffs on
Yeah.
battery-powered EVs
Yep.
imports. So yeah, so that's currently going on in this space, and yeah, I
Exactly.
mean, we can talk a little bit about this too.
Exactly. So it was in October that the EU's tariffs came into effect. So we're talking about, I believe, up to like 45% tariffs at the high end on EVs, depending on the company. And this is basically just trying to preserve the EU auto industry in the face of extremely good and extremely cheap Chinese electric vehicles. I think it's really funny that China just does a little shake and bake and says, all right, we'll sell hybrids and still sells into the EU. It just, shows how fast they are to just switch the strategy and still make some money, and how slow it is for these regulations and tariffs to really like have the effect you want when it takes so long to make decisions on them. So I think this is really relevant because we have like Europe is so rooted in the automobile industry, Germany particularly, obviously, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, just huge brands in the auto industry, right? And they're trying to compete against China, the US, Japan, Korea, others to really build the best cars at the best value. And what you're seeing, I think you're seeing a lot of this because you're witnessing like the real-time collapse of Germany's industrial production, right? So if we look at Germany's industrial production here, since this is 2017 over at the top left of this red line down to 2024, like 12% drop off from 6.5 years ago in industrial production. And when you look at how Germany fueled their factories, it was through Russian gas. And so when you had the war in Ukraine kick off and the cutoff of Russian gas, this has really hurt the German industrial engine and their ability to compete, as well as just regulation in Europe. As we've seen Draghi state, as we've seen the CEO of Ericsson state, as we've seen other European tech founders on X state, regulation in the EU and holding companies back from competing is killing competitiveness and the ability to build good products. So I believe right now Volkswagen is potentially going to have to shut down some plants in Germany. And so the employees are striking so that they don't shut down the plants, which of course, when a plant is almost bankrupt and you go on strike to stop them from shutting it down, it doesn't help the fundamentals of the business. And so to me, there's a little bit of a disconnect between the mindset of the European voters and politicians and what fundamentally needs to happen in terms of competition to make businesses more competitive, right? So this is kind of just a little bit of a sign of what's going to keep happening. I think is you're gonna have to try to block this to preserve existing industries, but ultimately, like these Chinese EVs cost like $10,000 or less on a cost basis to build. They sell them for like $25,000, and the strategy that Volkswagen was going for was producing less at a much higher value. And how many people are going to buy a Volkswagen at like 50, 60,000 versus a Chinese EV at like 25? So, I mean, these are really advanced. They look cool. I mean, here we have this Zeekr X. I mean, it's not like a sedan, but it's a nice EV. Lots of people would be happy to drive this at $25,000, right? So fundamentally, like, you can try to block these things. And I actually think there's a really good case for blocking these, because if China doesn't let you do business in their country, why should you let them do business in your country? I kind of think of it on very simplistic terms like that. Like, if you're like running a country, if you're in total control and you're looking over at your neighbor and you say, hey, do you want to buy some of my cars? And they say, yeah, sure. And then they take all your technology, they take all your patents, they steal it all, and then they cut your company out of the country. You're probably going to quit doing business with them, right? And so we kind of got to wake up to like the different type of competition that happens here. This isn't like the Western world where it's more competition based. It's really like taking intellectual property and then the state is subsidizing specific industries to compete. So on that side of the coin, I understand, but I also think like tariffs alone are not the answer here for the EU. They need to kind of take a page from the Department of Government Efficiencies plan and start cutting regulations so that you can build again. But one thing I really worry about is the cost of electricity. So the cost of electricity is much higher in Europe, in Germany. And if you want to be able to have cost-effective industrial production, you need a low cost of electricity and you need a supply chain. So these are some really big problems to solve. Yeah, Emmanuel, what do you think? I mean, you've obviously, lived in Germany. You have some firsthand experience. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure like if it's only like these car manufacturers' fault. I also think it's also itself in Germany. We're quite slow in adopting new technology. So even if Volkswagen or Audi or Mercedes come out with these electric vehicles, I mean, if you go to Germany, they're very slow at adopting electric vehicles. But not only that, I mean, it also with like new tech. And
Mhm.
I think previously we covered Bitcoin, and you showed the adoption rate of Bitcoin in Europe. I can fully see why Germany isn't adopting that as well as quick. Uh,
Yeah.
and I would say it's also a little bit of culture that has to play into it. I mean, Germany is also still we're still a country that focuses on or primarily uses cash. We love cash. If you go to each
Yeah.
person, we love the physicality of it. So
I like cash
it's
too. Yeah.
it's a little bit tough, but something I wanted to say about the cars though. I mean, they look incredible. I mean, from my perspective,
Yeah.
I mean, you look at Seeker X, and I think on the cover page we had Xpeng. I mean, you have other brands like Neo, BYD, and
Yeah.
they're rolling out all these cars, and I am curious to see like how well spec they are
Yeah,
compared to
they're
like the
better.
European
They're
cars, right?
better. That's the thing. We used to see China as like cheaper but worse, right? And
Mm,
now what you're seeing is actually cheaper and better in certain categories, right? Like DJI has the best drones in the world, and China has the best EVs in the world. Uh, I think the best reference point I heard on this was Mark Andreessen talking about meeting with a major investor in the Middle East, one of these guys who owns the city, whether it was, he didn't say the name.
yeah.
Maybe it was, uh, maybe it was actually one of the princes, but basically this guy has a collection of luxury cars, right? He's got all the BMWs, he's got all the Mercedes, he's got the Teslas, he's got everything. And he replaced his daily driver fleet, his little entourage of cars that drive him around, with Chinese EVs because they're the nicest with the most features. I mean, these are like the affordable ones, but the luxury ones, like the seats, like rotate for you so you can get in. They're full of features. They've got all the latest tech. So it's not like these are just the cheapest options. These are also the nicest EVs. And it's just we don't really have that perspective because we're kind of blocking these out of the Western markets. But that's kind of the concern as well, is we're losing on quality and on cost, right? So yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so really interesting. Ultimately, the auto industry is not my favorite industry. Most auto companies go bankrupt. I think there's better things that countries can focus on in addition to this, but really interesting to see what happens. This is obviously like a big cultural industry for Europe and the backbone of a lot of the European industrial production.
Yeah. But sorry,
Cool.
can we just go back to
Yeah.
one more thing about this one? Yeah, I mean, just as you mentioned before about the price, about the cars, I have here a quote from CNN as well, and I think it actually depicts it really well. I mean, the way that these Chinese brands were able to push down their costs. This quote from CNN is basically observers are saying it's a life and death race, and I mean, it's true. I mean, we see Tesla kicked off a price war on their Model 3 and Model Y cars, right? We remember that happening. And then there is BYD asking its suppliers to cut prices by 10% next year. So
Hmm.
it really does seem like a competition, and it's most likely whoever gets out alive, kind of. So I mean, that's something I just wanted to add as well, considering the cost of these.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have to realize we don't just get to show up and build the best products and the best companies. I mean, there was a graphic circulating on Twitter of top public companies in the US versus Europe. See if I can pull that up. But basically, it just goes to show like you can't just show up and have the most value created in your country, right? Or in your trade block, right? So you have to compete and you have to build the best products and you have to have regulation that makes sense and that allows you to do mega projects and to compete at scale. And especially, I mean, you know, Sweden has an excellent economy. They produce lots of products themselves, but Sweden can't get to the scale that they need without other really capable partners throughout the EU to help them with this, right? So I think, you know, we have to be ready to build, and business is competitive. You know, it's not that you just show up, you build a car. People think these big companies will just always be around, right? They're like, oh, it's big business, you know, they'll just, oh, it's Volkswagen, like they should just be able to pay us a higher salary and have us like take long vacations. No, you have to show up and you have to build a better product. That was like the memo that Elon sent to the Tesla employees. Like, you will work in the office, you will be there, you'll be there a minimum of 40 hours a week. You can go to some other company and you can work less, but when was the last time they shipped a good product? That was basically the email he sent after everyone was working remote after COVID for a little bit, right? So I think that's kind of a little bit of a mindset shift that I think it's quite different in Europe because there's so much of a social support system and people don't grind as hard in general. I mean, when I was at one of the main co-working spaces in Stockholm, I was like the only guy there on the weekend. And it's like, aren't these guys trying to build companies? Like, where are they? And it was just a ghost town on the weekend. And you know, it's a balance, right? Like, you don't necessarily want your week to be like a Chinese employee's week. You don't want to have nets on your windows so that you don't jump out like Foxconn had, but you have to compete in order to have these social systems. So I think it's going to be really interesting, and we'll see how the EU does. It's not the most natural union in terms of like the geopolitics and the geography of the countries. So we'll see how things move forward.